I'm Heather. After many wasted years trying outdated approaches to my daughter's addiction that felt wrong to me, harmed our relationship, and didn't help my daughter, I finally found an effective, evidence-based approach that repaired my relationship with her, helped me create my own peace of mind, and made me an ally in my daughter's recovery. I teach you a loving and compassionate approach to help you encourage change and create connection. Addiction impacts the entire family system. Family recovery is the answer. Today, you're going to hear a conversation between Beth Syverson and I about the intersection of adoption trauma and addiction. Even if you haven't been affected by adoption, I know that you're going to get something out of this episode. The more challenging experiences that I have in my life, and the more I learn about what other people in this world are experiencing, the more compassion I have for just the human experience in general. And that helps me lead a more connected life because instead of looking at everything with judgment, I just have this natural curiosity now. So I hope it helps you listen to this episode to understand your fellow humans and your child a little bit more and just looking for your similarities in these experiences, even if you haven't been touched by adoption at all. I've had Beth on the podcast a couple of times, but it's kind of blows my mind that we've never talked about adoption trauma. So I wanted to have her come on the podcast and share that part of her story. Beth Syverson is an adoptive mom of a 19-year-old son, Joey, who has been struggling with addiction and mental health issues for several years. She struggles with addiction as well, though not with the same substances as her son. This experience has given her empathy for her son's struggles. She is walking beside Joey as he struggles with his recovery, while she works on her own personal growth and healing. Joey and Beth started Safe Home Podcast in August 2021 in order to help other families avoid the pain they've endured. 6 weeks after it started, Joey relapsed, but he gave Beth his blessing to continue this important work, even suggesting an episode about relapse. Now the podcast has a new name, Unraveling Adoption, and she is continuing the work focusing on supporting adoptive parents. Last fall, she started APtitude, a support group for adoptive parents facing adoption's challenges. Beth is committed to destigmatizing addiction and mental illness, and she wants to help other families touched by adoption to find their own healing path. I hope you enjoy this episode. So thanks for coming on today, Beth, to talk about unraveling adoption with us.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for the opportunity and always relish the chance to talk to you any way I can. So happy to be here.
Yeah, I've learned so much from you about adoption. I was pretty ignorant to it before I met you and started following your journey and learning as you go. So do you want to share with us why you switched gears from the Safe Home podcast to Unraveling Adoption?
Yeah. So Safe Home was what Joey and I created in 2021. And we included topics: adoption, addiction, mental health, and diversity. So we kind of rotated between those 4 topics. And adoption did come up every once in a while as a main topic or kind of tangentially a lot of the time. But it was really hard to find an audience because it was so spread out between those 4 things. And I just feel so drawn to helping adoptive parents particularly figure this stuff out, which will hopefully help their adopted children. And I want to elevate adoptee voices as much as possible. And I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop talking to people about it. And so I'm like, I've got to change the name of the podcast and change my format. So I now talk about those same 4 things, but adoption's kind of over the top of all of them. So underneath adoption, there's going to be addiction, mental health, and diversity issues, but all of it's going to link to adoption in the new podcast, which is Unraveling Adoption.
Yeah. So your son is adopted, and that's really what got you interested in that. So and you noticed this link between adoption or adoption trauma and substance use. You want to share more about that with us?
Yeah, I didn't link it together. At first, I was super ignorant. And even though I was an adoptive parent, I was super ignorant. And I just thought, what is happening to my son? I have no idea. Well, and no one, it's really a tangled web anyway. It's not like I have figured it out. But an adoptee friend of mine said, Beth, isn't Joey adopted? This was after his crisis and he was deep into addiction and suicidality and all that. Isn't he adopted? I'm like, well, yeah. What does that have to do with anything? She goes, you might want to go look into that. And she was very nice. And she gave me a bunch of resources, a couple of books, and the name of an adoption therapist, which I started seeing, and Joey started seeing her too. And all of a sudden, the lights came on like, oh, he has no sense of self-worth. And not just like the regular old no sense of self-worth that a lot of people have, but like literally his birth mother threw him away. Like, it is not just a metaphor. She couldn't take him. And for her side of the story, I don't know. It's probably her parents. It's complicated. And no one's blaming anybody in any of this, but that he does not have a persona before being relinquished when he was born. Can you imagine that? I just think, God, like I've had bad shit happen to me, but I can remember before that. I have memories of who I was before my divorce or before some bad accident or whatever. There is a me before that. But for Joey and a lot of adoptees that were born or adopted very early in life, they have no self before. And the memories aren't really there when you're an infant. Your cognition isn't built in yet. You don't have words. And so it just lodges in this kind of nebulous space. It really lives in the body. If anyone's read The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk, it's an amazing book about how trauma, any kind of trauma, it doesn't live in your frontal lobe of your brain. It lives in your body. And so once I started piecing this together, I'm like, oh, and then I felt terrible because I'm like, why didn't I know this? And then I had to realize I can't know what I don't know. You told me that. And just giving myself some grace for not knowing. And then, okay, now that I know, what can I do? So I've tried to find as many adoptee supports as possible for Joey. Sometimes he doesn't want them, but I just kind of create a smorgasbord. Here you go, Joey. I've got all these resources for you. You can have any of them, none of them, some of them. And if you forget, I'll always have the numbers for you and you can ask me for the numbers again. So that's kind of what I've done. And I think it has helped Joey, even though it's extremely difficult to deal with. And Joey, he's only 19, but I think he has a lot more insight than people much older than him. Some adoptees don't, quote, come out of the fog. That's what a lot of people call it when you kind of realize the impact of adoption on you. They don't come out of the fog till they're my age. So he's coming out of the fog at 19, but it's painful. It's like waking up to realizing, oh, that's why I want to numb every feeling I have because it's all just intolerable. And this is really heavy and primal, so deep for him. So it's difficult. So I don't try jam it down his throat or anything, say, you're traumatized, stuff like that. But just I try to offer support and understanding and empathy as much as I can.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought up that primal feeling and that book, The Body Keeps the Score, because I started following somebody that I saw through one of your pages about that was talking about adoption. And it was talking about how like the baby's body knows that is not their mom. That's not what they've been familiar with. And so like what that causes to not even have that connection with that person anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was your only the whole point of infancy is safety. That's your whole goal as an infant, is to feel safe. And did not have that, even in utero, because his birth mother was probably so distraught and stressed out and didn't feel safe, even in utero. So if you just start off life not feeling safe, well, that's going to manifest itself in all sorts of self-destructive behaviors. Substance use, a lot of adopted people struggle with substances. statistically, I think it's 43% of adults who are adopted, 43% more adult adoptees have had substance use disorder in their lifetime than non-adopted people. That's
Wow.
a huge increase. And people do all sorts of other self-harm, cutting that kind of self-harm, or abusive relationships, or can't hold jobs, or just this kind of wandering kind of unsettledness that I see all the time with adoptees. It's very common. And of course they would. Of course they would. And it's not some disease, it's not some disorder. It's a natural response to literally never feeling safe.
Yeah. And I was listening to this book about being dysregulated the other day, and they were talking about how all those things that you just mentioned, even like self-harm or an eating disorder, or like those things that you only see the bad in, but they actually, like, your body produces opioids, like its own painkillers, which actually kill the emotional pain for them, or gives some relief from it, at least. This is something I never understood before. Like with my daughter, before there was addiction, although she wasn't adopted, she did have a lot of birth trauma. Before that, there was an eating disorder, which I found out from that also releases those natural painkillers. And there was self-harm. And so the more we learn about like how these biological processes in our body, how much it's connected to that, like so much of it really does make sense. And there's so much easier to drop the judgment about what's happening.
Yes. If you think about it, like how brilliant was he? He dissociated in order to survive. And so Joey's flight response, his running away, his numbing out, his get me out of here mode is so strong, but he had to. Of course he did that. If you can just think, well, how smart of a baby was that? He dissociated so he could survive. And unfortunately, it doesn't serve a person to stay dissociated your whole life. I mean, it makes a really tough way to live. But and whatever is causing the addiction, I think there's something underneath everyone's addiction, right? Behaviors make sense. And I don't know what kind of trauma anyone's had, but that person knows somewhere deep inside of them, they know what happened. Maybe it was something that happened repeatedly, like neglect is not like a one-time horrible incident, but something that happened. And so our bodies and our souls, they figure it out. They figure out how to deal with it. And unfortunately, when you're like 6 months old, it might not be the the most highly developed way, but you got to hand it to them. They figured out a way to literally survive.
Yeah, but like dissociation is like all a baby has, right?
That's all they can do. They are nothing.
They can't run.
They can't run. They can't use their words. They can't fight. They can just disappear in their mind. So Joey is gone most of the time in his mind, whether or not he's using substances.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it gives you a lot of compassion. And I love that you're letting me talk about adoption on your show, because I know that not very many people probably on your show that listen to your show are adopted or have adoption in their personal life, but probably everyone knows someone adopted. And if anyone's in any sort of treatment centers, I bet you $1 million there's a bunch of adopted people and foster people in that situation. And foster kids, that's a whole nother layer of more trauma. Because usually if you're fostered, I guess unless both parents die or something, usually there's some sort of major trauma that necessitates you being removed from the home. So, so that population is just very prevalent in the addiction world, unfortunately.
Well, I think the more we understand and just look at and are curious about human behavior in general, like some of my greatest lessons, like one piece of the puzzle, or some pieces of the puzzle have come from watching your journey and understanding about adoption and opening my mind up about my belief system about that. What I went through with breast cancer, like really taught me a lot about, even though it didn't have anything to do with addiction, it's just this common humanity of understanding people's struggles. And it's funny that you brought the book up, The Body Keeps a Score, because I was reading that book in the doctor's office the day that I got diagnosed with breast cancer.
Oh,
And I loved that book. I was really interested in it, but I was talking to a friend about it like 6 months ago, and I was like, I can't make myself read that book. I don't understand. Like, I haven't actually read a book. I've listened to books, but I haven't read one since then. And we started going through it, and I'm realizing I was like reading the book when the doctor walked in the doctor's office. So of course, right? I didn't even like
yeah.
make that connection with my brain, but it's in there in my body, keeping me from wanting to read. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll read again at some point.
Yeah. So, but before you had that understanding, you might have thought you were lazy or procrastinating or just not strong enough. I don't know. We make up all sorts of stories about things, but yeah, that gives yourself so much more self-compassion. And we can apply that kind of logic or understanding to anybody that's struggling. There's a reason that you're not doing X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
There's always a reason. And it's not usually just because you're bad. That I don't believe that's true for anybody, really.
Yeah. And I think my question to myself was, what's wrong with me? And that was the question I kept asking about my daughter too, when she first started struggling. So it wasn't as charged when I was saying what's wrong with me. It was more curious, but still, even the wording, the more I realize, the more my curiosity even changes and the less charge there is, even with those kinds of questions. Like, there's always something going on underneath the surface. Nothing is ever really just what it seems. So knowing what you know now about adoption trauma, because you didn't know any of that going into it when you adopted Joey, what would you do differently?
Oh, so many things. And yeah, I had never heard the term before my friend brought it up when Joey was in crisis. So what I would have done differently if I had known about adoption trauma, this is what I think I would have done. I would have put him in some sort of therapy, not because he was broken or anything, but to get support. I think that it's adoptive parents' duty to figure out what our kids' unique needs are, because our kids are like kind of like special needs kids, right? They have a special need. They were relinquished. They have this trauma that's built in. And no matter how great of a parent I am, I can't overcome that piece of it because that has already happened and has already influenced him quite a bit. So they have play therapy for like babies and toddlers. So I would find a attachment or adoption competent play therapist and just provide therapy as needed whenever he's struggling. So therapy would have been like at the table anytime. Oh, you want therapy? Here you go. Here's some more therapy, whatever you want. So that would be, and I would have gotten myself therapy for me to navigate adoption and being an adoptive parent. I would have found adoption competent therapist for myself like I did when much later, but boy, that would have helped if I had known all that stuff earlier. I would have done things like, well, I adopted Joey from Japan and Joey's dad is Japanese American, but not very Japanese. He was pretty disconnected from his culture. But what I would have done is kept Joey connected somehow to his Japanese culture, either learned the language with him or made dishes, Japanese food, or made sure he had Japanese people in our friend circle. And, I offered him to go to Japanese school, but he's like, hell no, mom. Well, he didn't say that to me when he was a kid, but his idea was, hell no, I hate school. Why would I want to go to another day of school to learn Japanese? But what I'm hearing now from other transracial adoptees is the whole family learns Japanese. The whole family goes, oh, now we're a Japanese American family, right? We're a hybrid family. So we're going to all learn Japanese. Wouldn't that have been great? Instead of sending him off to school, another day of school, why don't we just all take a Japanese class or, learn the numbers together, something simple, What else would I have done? I would have just been more alert to addiction being a possibility because like I said, it's like 40 something percent higher incidence for adopted people. So I would have been much more on alert. And when at 11, 12, Joey started acting out, I would have said, I wonder if this might be addiction or substance use. And let's nip this in the bud instead of like, oh, my kid would never do that. Why would he do that? That's not something our family does. I was so in denial and just like no, that can't be. That can't be. So if I had known the incidence of addiction, and not to mention suicidality is 4 times, adoptees are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide as non-adopted people. That's a huge percentage. So I would have been much more alert to that. And when he came home from elementary school with a slit wrist, I would have said, okay, stop the clock here. Instead of like, well, that's weird. What'd you do that for? But I didn't realize the amount of pain. And later on, he's told me that ever since elementary school, he's wanted to be dead. Like he's always had really bad thoughts of death, like constantly. So it breaks my heart to think about all the stuff he carries around with him. But so much I would have done differently.
Yeah. There's so much good stuff in there, what you said. One thing that really stuck out to me was when you were talking about, like, instead of sending him to school by himself to learn Japanese, that the whole family would learn it together. Like, so we have this, and it made me think about like family recovery.
Yeah,
right?
same
we
thing.
have this idea that the person who's struggling should conform. They need to change. But it's that same principle of the family working together towards unity and change, and not just expecting one person to conform.
Yeah. What do we tend to do? We tend to send our kids off to rehab, which I've done many times. Here, you go fix it. You go fix yourself. Here, go over there. And they really need, like, do they have this? Family rehab recovery places, like everybody go, like a little vacation. Except it's harder work than vacation. They should make that.
I mean, I think that there are some places that have good family programs that include family, but I think quite often the family isn't as included as they should be, or rarely included at all. I mean, the time Solana was in treatment, I think we might have had 1 or 2 total family sessions. A lot of them scheduled that didn't actually happen, but it's so important that it's the whole family, no matter what it is.
Yeah, eating disorder, whatever is going on with our kids, it's not just them. They develop this coping mechanism within this cycle or system that the whole family is part of. And you can't just take this person out and expect them to just be good to go. It's just unrealistic. And it's not accepting our parts in it. I don't use the same substances as Joey, but I use other substances and other behaviors. And, maybe he learned that from me. There's a lot of stuff that he learned from me that I didn't intend to teach him, but I did, or things that I didn't give him. So it's not we're not blaming anybody. It's no one's fault, but we're all part of it. Is that your philosophy too? Am I making that up?
Yeah. I mean, because if we knew better, we would do better. Like, we're all just doing the best we can. And the things that we've been doing, chances are, is what we learned. But it was interesting. It was like when I was recording a podcast episode with Helena, that it had never dawned on us before that we both just wanted to be numb. We just had different ways of getting there.
Yes. I remember that on your podcast. Yes. And when you can find that commonality, and go, yeah, Joey, God, I know because I've been working nonstop. I totally get it. I can't pull myself away. I understand that impulse to not be able to stop. I get it. And to find those commonalities, unfortunately, my addiction is work right now, and it's much more, valued in our society than other substances, but it's the same behavior. Yep. So I think that helps him to know that I understand. I deeply, deeply understand that craving and that it's so hard to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you said before too, about all of the education you would have gotten about trauma. And I'm listening to another book about trauma. And it's that one with Oprah, like What Happened to You?
Oh, yeah. I haven't read that yet, but that sounds so good.
It is. It's really good. And she was talking about how they made sure in her school, because a lot of the girls that were there came from a background with trauma and there was self-harm, and that all of the teachers had to be educated about how trauma shows up, and like that daydreaming in class is like a necessary escape for people who have experienced a lot of trauma in their life. So instead of thinking that that person isn't interested, doesn't care, isn't motivated, whatever, knowing like their brain just needs a break right now.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this trauma-informed education system is something, I think it's burgeoning, but there's so much work that can be done. And I hate to do this to teachers because they've already got so much stuff going on. But our education system, they need to get on board with trauma. I wish they were more educated about adoption as well. I mean, that would be amazing if teachers were more sensitive about adoption. I mean, even just thinking about the stupid family tree you have to draw when you're in fourth grade. How do you think that feels to adoptees? That's not fun. Or bring your baby picture in. A lot of adopted and fostered kids don't have baby pictures in. Just simple things like that, that teachers or people in your community, ministers and Sunday school teachers, people that interact with the public, if they can be more aware of trauma, adoption trauma, all these things, so we can just be more understanding when people behave in kind of baffling ways. There's always something behind it. Why is my kid spacing out? Why is my kid not turning anything in? Why are they get that curiosity going?
Yeah, definitely approaching with curiosity. So, and you've made a lot of good points about like paying more attention to how adoption could affect somebody. But what are some other things that are like commonly misunderstood about adoption?
Well, our narrative in the United States, anyway, is that adoption is just great. It fixed a problem. There was a parent that couldn't parent, and these parents wanted a baby, and look, voila, it's all done. It's all taken care of now. But there's a couple of problems with that. One is that no one's thinking about how it feels to the adoptee. Someone suggested to imagine in the middle of the night, an alien comes and replaces your spouse with someone else, and you wake up to a whole new spouse. How would that feel? It's kind of like how it would feel for an adopted person when they're an infant and don't know what's going on. By the way, adoptees grow up. They're not always children. We always talk about adopted children, but they're like grown up adults and still dealing with this kind of stuff. So no one thinks about that. Also, no one thinks about the birth parents. A lot of times the birth parents are coerced by maybe the grandparents or maybe by husband or whoever. So there's a lot of coercion or like downright theft of children. There's a lot of trafficking, like seriously, especially intercountry adoptions. It's really, really bad ethical situations in a lot of countries. And US is not being very proactive around that. So it seems like, oh, isn't this great? We took a child from an orphanage in China or Korea or wherever. Oh, isn't that great? Well, it's cool. It's very possible that those children they have parents. They just were poor and put them in an orphanage while they could make some more money. And then their child disappeared. Stuff like that happens a lot. So this happy unicorns and butterflies idea of adoption is just very short-sighted, and it's very painful for adoptees to continually have to defend their sadness. Like it sucks for the adoptees, for a lot of them. I shouldn't say all, but for many of them who are able to really figure it out, it's very, very painful to be relinquished. I mean, that's just painful. And so to force them to be grateful, oh, aren't you grateful you have such good parents that took you in? They didn't have to do that. Or you could have been aborted. For God's sake, people ask that about adoptees all the time. How would you like to be asked that? That's horrible. So just to kind of put yourself in an adoptee's shoes, to always, it's one of they're expected to endure this trauma and be grateful for it. And that's just not fair. That's just not fair to put on anybody. So that's the main thing. And that I work with a lot of adoptive parents. And even if you're the best adoptive parent in the whole wide world, you're still going to deal with adoption trauma. So the adoption trauma doesn't necessarily have to do with your parenting. It has to do with what happened before. Now, adoptive parents a lot of times make things worse. They pile on the trauma. A lot of adoptees get abused by their adoptive parents. It's really terrible statistics around that. A lot of adoptive parents are very suppressive or repressive or shaming or talk bad about their birth family. Oh, they're just trash. They're in jail. They're drug addicts. All this kind of blaming, shaming language, which is their blood relatives. So adoptive parents can heap on the trauma. But even if you're like perfect, saintly adoptive parents, there's going to be trauma. So that's what I believe anyway. And a lot of adoptees would agree with me. And if we can go at it looking that way, like, okay, what can I do as an adoptive parent or as a community member or as a minister or a teacher? What can I do to make this person's life a little better and help them to deal with this layers of burden that they were born with?
Yeah. And I know some adoptees who have this grief over a lifetime of feeling so different than the family, their adopted family they grew up with. And then if they get to meet their birth family and see how they're so much like them, this period of really grieving, not growing up with people who are mirroring who you really are inside.
That mirroring is so important. And we don't think about that if we're not adopted. We don't realize that everyone we look at a family reunion looks like us. And adoptees, particularly transracial adoptees, but every adoptee, they just look around and go, no one looks like me. I don't belong here. I hear adoptees say, I'm always looking at faces out in public, or when you're a kid, you just look, could that be my mother? Could that be my mother? Could that be my mother? It's just a constant and just, it's a natural, instinctual thing that's beneficial to a child, right? To be able to recognize your people who are supposed to be taking care of you. That's a natural drive. And you take that away and you just feel like you don't belong anywhere. And how must that feel? That must feel terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I guess, is one of you mentioned some of the additional challenges, transracial adoptions. Is there anything else that you want to add on that topic?
Yeah. So there's transracial, which is, it could happen domestically, like within the United States, you could have transracial. And transracial can also be part of intercountry adoption. So, and every time you add one of those extra layers, you add even more trauma. And I did an intercountry adoption, and I think it's just fraught. I think it's fraught. And I hope that someday that the United States will clean up our act and just make it much more ethical. And I really feel like ripping a child from their home country and taking them halfway around the world is really not the right thing to do. And what I can't do anything now, I'm not going to go return it. I would never do that. But I just try to let people know, maybe if they're thinking about adopting overseas, that it's extremely complicated and it's really just not fair to the child. And I'm not anti-adoption, but I call myself a family preservationist. So I think our culture, if we took all the money, adoption is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the US. So if we took that money and not to mention intercountry adoption, which is very expensive, take that money and support the birth family with rehab, with mental health supports, with childcare. I don't know, surround them with the help that they need so their child can stay with them. Then the birth mother and the child will not be traumatized by separation. And it will solve these giant systemic issues in the world, but it will never happen. But that would be my dream. And if you do need to adopt, relinquish and adopt out, find someone very close geographically, culturally, racially, so the child isn't just swimming in totally foreign waters. Keep them as close as possible, preferably a family member, even like a second cousin or something is better than just complete strangers halfway around the world. And now I can see it so clearly. Back then, I wasn't thinking about Joey, which sounds horrible because it's my son and you would think I was thinking about him, but I was really thinking about our family. I wanted to build a family and I thought it would be good for him, but I wasn't thinking from his point of view. So that's why I try to put the word out there for other people so they can get this quicker. Or maybe if they're thinking about intercountry adoption, they can think, well, maybe there's someone closer to home that needs help. Or maybe I could support a family different ways.
Yeah. As another connection I just made while I was listening to you was when you said thinking about it from the adoptee's point of view. And like that's part of what's so important with helping our kids with substance use is thinking about things from their point of view. Like we go into trying to help somebody and the missing link is, our heart is in the right place, but we miss every time because we're coming from our point of view. We're not taking the time to see and really be curious about without fixing, but just to understand the other person's point of view and how to help them from that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. They're probably not doing it, whatever their addictive behavior is, they're probably not doing it just to piss you off as a parent.
Yeah.
There's probably some stuff behind there that if you dug a little bit, you could find it out. Yeah. That empathy is so important and so hard because to do that, you have to have some self-awareness and it takes a certain amount of personal growth have had to happen for you to get to that place. So therapy for all, go get some therapy.
Yeah, we've been talking about self-awareness in the Invitation to Change group. We just started that section. And it's so interesting to me that like before I started this journey, I consider myself very self-aware. But the more I learn, the more I realize how unaware I was of myself and I hadn't really taken the time to actually get to know myself and what really mattered to me most and what I really valued. And values is something that we've talked about in those meetings too. And it's so that self-awareness, like taking a moment to just look into that and really be open to the idea that you might not be as self-aware as you think.
Yeah, I think that's just a growth trajectory, right? And maybe 10 years from now, we'll think, oh God, we thought we knew what we were talking about 10 years ago, but oh, we were so naive. It's just, we continue to grow. Hopefully that's the goal, I guess, to continue to grow. And yeah, I thought we were pretty good before Joey had his crisis at age 15. I thought we were doing good. He was in baseball. We were doing the things that people do, but we were just scratching the surface. And Joey's addiction and suicidality and this journey that we've been on for 4 years has forced me to grow so much. And I'm grateful. I wish it didn't have to happen that way, but I am grateful because Joey and I are so much closer now. And I have grown so much and feel so much more able to help other people and feel so much more authentic and aligned in myself. So I'm grateful now. It's still extremely painful. I'm not like waking up going, yay, let's deal with some more of this heavy stuff today. But I'm grateful and I feel like it's moving me forward more than an easy life could ever have done, right? A comfortable life.
Yeah, I would have never, ever taken the time to look into myself. If it was nothing other than my love for Helena and the pain of the struggle in our relationship would have made me change like this, to change my whole belief system, change my career.
Yeah.
To, go way outside of my comfort zone to start a business, all of that stuff to help other families going through this. Yeah, I would have never done any of that stuff if it wasn't for like learning from pain.
Yeah, right. If you're just comfortable just floating around, well, why would you want to dig any deeper? That hurts. It hurts. But the pain is a good teacher. I think Joey's my best teacher ever.
Yeah.
I've learned so much from him and I'll keep learning because it's going to be a lifelong journey. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Helena's my best teacher. She's still teaching me. So if we're willing to let them be our teachers, how much really they have to teach us.
Yeah.
So besides the podcast, if there's anybody listening to this who's interested in learning more about adoption or is touched by adoption, what else are you offering?
Well, I have an adoptive parents group. It's open to adoptive parents, foster parents, kinship parents, any sort of parents that aren't the birth parents. But I'd say adoptive parents just because it's easier. It's called APtitude. And it is for parents who are willing to go down this path. It's not like the unicorns and butterflies support group. It is my kids using substances and got kicked out of school. Now what do I do? It's that kind of stuff. People are in the same boat as I am. And some of them have little kids and they're trying to prevent that, which I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have gotten on board when my kid was 6 months old. Bravo. So we're just taking people through the primal wound, which is that book that I read about adoption trauma. We're taking them, I bring speakers to them once a month, usually adoptees, sometimes birth parents or adoptive parents. And we have a private Facebook group and a database of resources for adoptive parents. And that group is free. You can find it on my website, unravelingadoption.com. And you can set that up. And I also promote events and things like that. I occasionally show film screenings like the film Reckoning with the Primal Wound, which I just did, which is an amazing film. Everyone should watch that. And I do speaking, and I can speak to groups or teachers or therapists or parents, or if anyone has a group that needs a speaker, I'd be happy to come talk about adoption. I kind of feel like my niche right now is the intersection between adoption and addiction.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so needed. Like once I saw it, that you pointed it out, I started seeing it everywhere and noticing, the connection there, that how many people were touched by adoption that were struggling with substance use. So I'm going to put all of that information in the show notes as well. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share this information with the audience.
Oh, thank you so much, Heather. And again, thank you for bringing this to everybody's attention. And of course, thank you for being my life coach and helping me turn our family around. Again, I know I've told you this a billion times, but our family would absolutely not be where we are today without you. And I'm so grateful for you in my life.
Yeah. Well, it's been amazing to watch how hard you guys have been willing to work and then to run with it. And you're doing so many amazing things. So it's like this great full circle moment to get you to come back on and talk about this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it 2 different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.